Picture the dense, triple canopy jungle of the Annamite Range in the late 1960s. Beneath this impenetrable ceiling of green, an invisible, perpetual conveyor belt is moving. Thousands of kilometers of camouflaged dirt roads, concealed truck parks, and underground storage bunkers make up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, serving as the primary logistical artery for communist forces operating in South Vietnam. To sever this artery, the United States military is unleashing one of the most concentrated aerial bombardment campaigns in human history. Flights of B-52 Stratofortress bombers are dropping thousands of tons of high explosives, aiming to shatter the supply lines. Formations of F-4 Phantom II fighter bombers are strafing truck convoys, while millions of dollars in acoustic and seismic sensors are scattered across the jungle floor to track movement. Yet, the supply lines never break. The weapons, the artillery shells, and the rockets keep flowing south. In the deep, air-conditioned recesses of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, intelligence officers were confronting a maddening logistical reality. Conventional interdiction was failing. No matter how many supply depots were flattened from the air, the sheer mathematical volume of material supplied by the Soviet Union and China meant that enough hardware would always slip through the net. It was a problem that conventional warfare simply could not solve. If you destroy a bridge, the enemy will inevitably rebuild it. If you destroy a truck convoy, the enemy will eventually replace it. The planners realized they had to completely reframe the problem. If the United States military could not physically stop the boxes of ammunition from arriving at their destinations, they needed to make the enemy utterly terrified to open them. Welcome to our ongoing investigation into the hidden mechanics of asymmetric warfare. If you're fascinated by declassified military history, covert engineering, and the lengths to which intelligence agencies will go to manipulate the battlefield, consider subscribing to the channel as we bypass the official narratives to see how these legendary operations actually functioned. This conceptual pivot within the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, led to the birth of an operation that would eventually be known as Project Eldest Son. It was not a conventional sabotage mission. It was designed from the ground up as a highly contagious psychological virus meant to infect the enemy supply chain itself. The brain trust behind this initiative was the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, widely known in intelligence circles simply as MACV-SOG. This highly classified, multi-service special operations unit specialized in unconventional warfare, deep reconnaissance, and black operations across Southeast Asia. The analysts at MACV-SOG understood a fundamental truth about infantry combat. A soldier's ultimate lifeline is their weapon. In the brutal, unforgiving environment of the jungle, trust in that weapon must be absolute. For the North Vietnamese Army and the insurgent forces in the South, that trust was placed squarely in the AK-47 assault rifle. This legendary firearm was prized for its rugged simplicity, its ability to function after being submerged in mud or water, and its overall mechanical reliability. But a firearm is simply a piece of machined metal. Its effectiveness is entirely dependent on the quality of its ammunition. The logistical paradox that MACV-SOG sought to exploit was this absolute, unquestioning trust the communist forces placed in their supply lines. The insurgents trusted the massive state-run ammunition factories in Beijing and Moscow. They trusted the complex network of porters and truck drivers ferrying crates of 7.62 by 39 millimeter cartridges down the trail. To shatter the legend of the AK-47, American intelligence realized they did not need to destroy the rifles. They needed to weaponize the enemy's trust against them. The concept was brilliantly diabolical in its simplicity. American forces would capture authentic enemy ammunition, covertly tamper with it to ensure a catastrophic mechanical failure upon firing, and then seamlessly reintroduce it back into the enemy's own logistical network. Consider the profound psychological implications of this strategy. This was not about neutralizing enemy combatants one by one in firefights. It was about engineering a localized tactical elimination that would send shockwaves up the entire chain of command. If an insurgent pulls the trigger during an ambush and his weapon suffers a catastrophic structural failure resulting in a fatal outcome, the surviving members of his squad do not blame the Americans. They blame the rifle. They blame the ammunition. Most importantly, they blame their own quartermasters. When a soldier can no longer trust the bullets in their magazine, hesitation infects every tactical decision. Pulling the trigger transforms from an act of combat into a game of Russian roulette. If this fear spreads widely enough, a battalion commander might hesitate to order an offensive. worried that his heavily stockpiled munitions are actually a mass of defective, dangerous liabilities. By seeding the supply chain with rigged ammunition, MACV-SOG was not just destroying rifles. They were manufacturing systemic paranoia. However, conceptualizing a psychological virus is one thing. Engineering the physical vector to deliver it is an entirely different challenge. The technical hurdles facing the Central Intelligence Agency and military ordnance experts were staggering. The primary target hardware was the ubiquitous 7.62mm cartridge, though the project would eventually expand to include 12.7mm heavy machine gun rounds and even 82mm mortar shells. To make this deception work, the rigged ammunition had to be absolutely flawless. Insurgent armorers and logistics commanders were notoriously paranoid and meticulous. They routinely inspected their stockpiles for signs of water damage, corrosion, or tampering. If a communist sentry or quartermaster discovered a single crate of ammunition that looked slightly altered, the entire operation would be compromised. The enemy would simply discard the bad batch, realizing it was an American trick, and the psychological impact of the operation would evaporate instantly. This meant American engineers could not simply manufacture counterfeit bullets from scratch in a factory in the United States. Even the slightest deviation in the metallurgy of the brass casing, the specific shade of the primer sealant, or the exact stampings of the factory head stamp would be a dead giveaway to a trained inspector. The ammunition had to be genuine. The Central Intelligence Agency directed its Technical Services Division to solve this impossible problem. The mandate was clear. Ordnance experts had to take captured factory-authentic Chinese and Soviet ammunition, carefully dismantle each individual cartridge, remove the standard smokeless powder, and replace it with a highly specialized high-explosive compound. Then they had to press the original projectile back into the casing and reseal the entire unit. All of this had to be done without leaving a single microscopic trace of tampering. Think about the mechanical precision required for this task. When a bullet is manufactured at a state facility, the brass neck is crimped around the bullet using heavy industrial machinery, leaving specific tooling marks. The primer is often sealed with a precise ring of colored lacquer to prevent moisture intrusion. American technicians had to break that seal, extract the bullet without scratching the brass, and reassemble the cartridge so perfectly that it would pass a visual and physical inspection by the very people who relied on it for survival. Furthermore, the weight of the rigged cartridge had to perfectly match the weight of a standard round. If a specialized high-explosive compound was heavier or lighter than the original smokeless powder, an experienced insurgent handling a magazine might subconsciously notice the weight discrepancy. The center of gravity of the bullet could not shift. The external appearance could not change by a fraction of a millimeter. This was reverse engineering taken to its absolute extreme. The United States military was undertaking a massive artisanal manufacturing process to create a perfect counterfeit of a mass-produced item. Every single rigged cartridge had to be a flawless replica of its former self, transformed from a reliable piece of military hardware into a hidden, catastrophic liability. As intelligence analysts formalized the parameters of the operation, the sheer scale of the engineering challenge became daunting. How could defense contractors synthesize a customized explosive compound that would fit inside the tiny volume of a 7.62mm casing, yet possess enough brisance or shattering capability to completely obliterate the steel receiver of an AK-47? And once the Central Intelligence Agency managed to actually construct these invisible traps in a secure, covert laboratory, how on earth was MACV-SOG going to quietly sneak thousands of these rigged bullets back into the heavily fortified, heavily guarded enemy stockpiles hidden deep within the jungles of Laos and Cambodia? Deep inside a restricted ordnance laboratory on the Chinen Peninsula of Okinawa, Japan, technicians faced a blank slate of impossibility. The Central Intelligence Agency had provided this covert facility with thousands of captured communist cartridges. Their mandate was to transform these reliable logistical assets into microscopic Trojan horses. To understand the sheer scale of the engineering challenge they faced, we must examine the fundamental physics of how infantry ammunition actually functions. The mechanics of a standard firearm rely entirely on controlled deflagration. When the firing pin of an AK-47 strikes the primer of a 7.62 by 39mm cartridge, it ignites a small chemical spark. The spark flashes into the main casing, igniting the standard smokeless powder. This powder does not explode. It burns rapidly. As it burns, it generates a massive volume of expanding gas, creating a precise pressure curve that forces the heavy lead projectile out of the brass casing and down the rifled barrel at over 700 meters per second. The entire weapon system, from the thickness of the steel chamber to the weight of the bolt carrier, is mathematically engineered to harness and safely contain the specific pressure curve. The technicians in Okinawa had to disrupt this curve. To achieve the intended catastrophic structural failure, the substitute compound could not simply burn faster. It had to detonate. It required an entirely different velocity of chemical reaction, possessing immense brisance or shattering power. However, substituting the propellant presented an agonizing chemical puzzle. Standard smokeless powder consists of tiny, extruded cylindrical grains coated in graphite. If a suspicious insurgent armorer were to pull a bullet from its casing with a pair of pliers and pour out the contents onto a wooden table, the powder had to look, feel, and behave visually like standard factory propellant. A bright white, high explosive powder like RDX would instantly give the deception away. Furthermore, the customized explosive compound had to weigh exactly the same as the original load. The standard charge of Soviet 7.62 millimeter propellant weighs approximately 1.6 grams. If the high explosive substitute was even a fraction of a gram lighter or heavier, an experienced rifleman handling a 30-round magazine might subconsciously register the subtle shift in weight or center of gravity. Through relentless trial and error, the laboratory developed a bespoke, high-explosive substitute that perfectly mimicked the granulation, the dark color, and the exact specific gravity of standard nitrocellulose powder. Consider the physics of this invisible trap once it is triggered. When an insurgent operator pulls the trigger on a rigged round, the primer ignites the high-explosive substitute. Instead of a controlled pressure curve, an instantaneous supersonic shockwave is generated. The brass casing immediately vaporizes. The immense pressure spike vastly exceeds the tensile yield strength of the steel chamber. The solid steel trunnion of the weapon shatters into jagged shrapnel. The heavy steel bolt carrier is violently driven backward entirely off its guide rails, fracturing the receiver cover. This sequence results in the complete structural disintegration of the firearm and the immediate permanent neutralization of the operator. But the planners at the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, did not stop at infantry rifles. The operation quickly expanded to target heavier support weapons, requiring entirely different engineering solutions. A primary target became the 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun round, utilized heavily in the Type 53 heavy machine gun. These weapons formed the backbone of the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft network along the supply trails, frequently targeting low-flying American UH-1 Iroquois helicopters and A-4 Skyhawk attack jets. Rigging these massive cartridges required a larger volume of the customized explosive, designed specifically to shear the heavy steel locking lugs of the machine gun, instantly stripping an entire anti-aircraft crew of their primary weapon during a critical aerial engagement. Even more technically demanding was the sabotage of the 82 millimeter mortar shell. The mortar is a highly effective area denial weapon, lobbing high explosive fragmentation payloads in a high arcing trajectory. Standard operating procedure dictates that a crewman drops the thin, stabilized shell down a smoothbore launch tube. When the shell hits the bottom, a fixed firing pin ignites a primary launch charge housed inside the tail fin, propelling the shell out of the tube. The explosive payload itself is supposed to detonate only upon striking the target, triggered by a point detonating fuse on the nose. To turn this weapon against its operators, American ordnance experts carefully disassembled captured mortar shells and bypassed the complex safety mechanisms of the nose fuse. They re-engineered the internal firing train so that the moment the primary launch charge in the tail fin was ignited at the bottom of the tube, the main high-explosive payload of the shell would detonate simultaneously. The shell would never leave the mortar. The resulting enclosed detonation would completely obliterate the heavy steel launch tube, rendering a severe operational loss to the surrounding artillery crew. Yet, fabricating these lethal counterfeits was only half the technical hurdle. You cannot simply hand a loose, sabotaged cartridge to a field operative. Munitions travel in bulk. The Soviet and Chinese logistical networks transported ammunition in highly secure, weather-resistant packaging. Hundreds of rounds were packed into heavy, zinc-lined metal tins, colloquially known as spam cans, which were then sealed and placed inside robust wooden crates heavily secured with nails and industrial steel banding. To bypass the notoriously paranoid communist quality control inspectors, the technicians in Okinawa essentially had to become master forgers. They carefully pried open captured metal tins, unsealed the heavy wax paper bundles, and delicately inserted the sabotaged rounds. Then they had to meticulously solder the zinc tins back together. This required profound attention to detail. They had to artificially age the fresh solder. If a North Vietnamese quartermaster noticed a shiny new pool of metal on a tin that had supposedly been sitting in a damp jungle supply bunker for 3 months, the deception would collapse in an instant. The crates were renailed, the original Cyrillic or Mandarin factory shipping stencils were perfectly preserved, and exact replicas of the lead tamper-evident wire seals were reapplied to the exterior hardware. Notice the intense operational restraint required during this packaging phase. If a covert laboratory packed 20 rigged rounds into a single sealed tin, they would inevitably compromise the entire program. If the first round fired destroyed the weapon, the surviving insurgents would investigate. They would find 19 remaining sabotaged cartridges in the immediate vicinity, test them, and instantly realize they were facing a systematic, engineered American trap. The psychological virus would be isolated and neutralized. Therefore, intelligence planners established a strict, unyielding mathematical limit. Operatives were authorized to plant only one single sabotaged cartridge inside any given magazine or paper bundle. Only one single rigged mortar shell could be placed inside a wooden crate. By drastically diluting the contaminated hardware, the catastrophic structural failures would appear completely random. They would look exactly like isolated fatal manufacturing defects originating straight from the factory floors in Beijing or Moscow. As the sealed, perfectly counterfeited crates were loaded onto unmarked cargo planes and flown back to highly classified staging bases in South Vietnam, the true bottleneck of the entire operation emerged. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a simple dirt road wandering through the trees. It was a highly organized, deeply layered logistical matrix, stretching through the sovereign, officially neutral territories of Laos and Cambodia. The trail was heavily defended by interlocking anti-aircraft batteries, tens of thousands of dedicated logistics troops, and elite, roving security patrols utilizing trained guard dogs. The insertion paradox was staggering. How do you physically put the crates back into the supply chain? Conventional delivery was impossible. You could not drop the crates from an AC-130 Spectre gunship or a C-130 Hercules transport plane. If a perfectly intact crate of ammunition falls from the sky, the enemy immediately knows it is an American plant. You could not simply leave the boxes sitting randomly on a jungle path, as that would instantly trigger suspicion of an ambush or a booby trap. To infect the logistical network, the rigged munitions had to be seamlessly integrated into existing, heavily guarded stockpiles. They had to be placed in the exact middle of a stack of identical crates, deep inside a camouflaged subterranean bunker without the communist sentries ever realizing their perimeter had been breached. This requirement meant abandoning the safety of the laboratory entirely. It meant taking small, highly specialized teams of American operatives, stripping them of all identifying insignia, and inserting them directly into the most heavily fortified, unforgiving real estate in Southeast Asia. The tactical reality of delivering a microscopic Trojan horse into a sprawling, heavily defended enemy sanctuary began in the dark, vibrating cargo hold of a UH-1 Iroquois helicopter. Skimming just meters above the triple canopy jungle, specialized air crews flew nap of the earth, desperately trying to evade the interlocking network of communist anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the Laosian border. Inside, these helicopters sat small, highly autonomous units from the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. These operatives carried no standard identification. Their uniforms were completely sterilized, stripped of rank, name tapes, and unit insignia. In their rucksacks, alongside their standard combat loads, they carried heavily disguised, perfectly sealed crates and zinc tins of rigged ammunition. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a single, easily identifiable road. It was a vast, subterranean, and deeply camouflaged logistical matrix covering thousands of square kilometers in Laos and Cambodia. These were official denial areas. If an American reconnaissance team was compromised and captured in this sovereign, supposedly neutral territory, the United States government would categorically deny their existence. The operators stepping off the skids of these helicopters were walking into a tactical environment where the enemy held every conceivable numerical advantage. To understand the sheer audacity of this infiltration phase, you have to look at the standard operational doctrine of a long-range reconnaissance team and flip it entirely upside down. When a traditional deep penetration patrol located an isolated enemy supply depot, their standard operating procedure was immediate and destructive. They would map the coordinates, call in an overwhelming strike from a flight of F-4 Phantom II fighter bombers, or manually wire the bunker with C-4 explosives to level the area. The operators were trained to destroy enemy logistics at all costs. Project Eldest Son required immense operational restraint, demanding that these operators suppress their most basic tactical instincts. When a studies and observations group team discovered a camouflaged ammunition cache hidden beneath the roots of a banyan tree or tucked inside a limestone cave system, they were strictly ordered not to destroy it. Instead, they had to secure the perimeter, quietly infiltrate the depot, and meticulously manipulate the inventory. Consider the profound tension of this maneuver. The trails were heavily guarded by tens of thousands of dedicated North Vietnamese logistics troops, roving security patrols, and highly trained indigenous trackers utilizing guard dogs. An American operative had to slip past the sentries, enter the dark, damp environment of an underground bunker, and begin rearranging heavy wooden crates. Operating under the strict mathematical dilution protocols already established by the ordnance laboratories, the operatives unpacked their counterfeited materials. They might carefully pry open a genuine enemy crate, remove a single authentic paper bundle of 30 cartridges, and slide their exact counterfeit in its place. The original bundle was then quietly packed away to be taken back to base for future tampering. Every movement had to be perfect. If the operative left a scratch on the wooden lid, if they disturbed the dust on the tarp covering the crates, or if they left a single American boot print in the mud near the bunker entrance, the mission was compromised. Communist quartermasters were hyper-vigilant. At the slightest sign of an American breach, the enemy would instantly quarantine the entire depot, rendering the sabotaged rounds useless and exposing the entire psychological operation. To counter the threat of visual detection, some reconnaissance personnel utilized specialized footwear, wearing captured insurgent sandals or boots molded with bare footprint soles to mask their tracks around the supply bunkers. They moved like ghosts through the very heart of the enemy's logistical nervous system, leaving behind an invisible, dormant threat. But infiltrating stationary bunkers was only one method of insertion. The intelligence planners knew they needed to contaminate the supply chain at multiple points of contact to ensure the maximum spread of the psychological virus. This led to the development of battlefield contamination strategies, leveraging the chaotic, unpredictable nature of jungle firefights. Insurgent forces operating in the south were chronically short on supplies and routinely scavenged the battlefield for usable hardware. Studies and observations group operatives utilized this predictable behavior to their advantage. During a patrol, a team might intentionally engage a larger enemy element. After initiating contact, the American team would execute a rapid, tactical withdrawal. In the deliberate confusion of the retreat, an operator would intentionally leave behind a seemingly pristine AK-47 magazine dropped on the trail, or a captured insurgent chest rig resting against a tree stump. To the pursuing enemy troops, this looked like a stroke of immense tactical luck. A fleeing American reconnaissance team had dropped valuable ammunition in their haste to escape. The insurgents would eagerly retrieve the 30-round magazine, completely unaware that 29 of the rounds were factory authentic, while one single cartridge harbored a customized high-explosive payload waiting to shatter their receiver. The insertion of rigged, heavier munitions required even bolder tactical execution. The 82mm mortar shell was a massive, heavy piece of ordnance. Sneaking a sabotage shell into the logistical flow was highly complex. Reconnaissance teams would spend days observing enemy troop movements, mapping out prepared, unoccupied mortar pits positioned along ridges overlooking American supply routes. In the dead of night, operatives would navigate the treacherous, often heavily booby-trapped perimeter of the pit. They would locate the ammunition ready racks, staged near the heavy steel launch tubes, swap a single factory shell with their perfectly counterfeited explosive variant, and vanish back into the dense foliage. The next time an insurgent artillery crew occupied that position to harass an American fire base, they would blindly reach into the rack, drop the finned shell down the smoothbore tube, and initiate a catastrophic structural failure right inside their own perimeter. Month after month, these highly classified reconnaissance teams executed these high-risk insertions. Hundreds of spiked cartridges and rigged mortar shells were quietly spliced into the logistical arteries flowing south. Yet, as the operation expanded, a profound strategic anxiety began to settle over the command staff back at the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. The physical vector of the operation had been successfully deployed. The counterfeit ammunition was circulating. But planting the trap was only half the equation. A mechanical failure in the jungle is just a mechanical failure. If an insurgent's rifle suffers a fatal malfunction during a firefight, his squadmates might simply write it off as an anomaly. They might assume the rifle had a microfracture in the steel, or that mud had obstructed the barrel, causing an overpressure event. If the enemy command simply attributed these localized tactical eliminations to poor maintenance, the psychological virus would fail to replicate. The American planners realized that for Project Eldest Son to actually fracture the enemy's operational capability, the North Vietnamese High Command had to be aggressively pushed to the correct conclusion. The enemy had to be convinced, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they were being supplied with systematically defective, dangerously substandard ammunition by their own allies. This required a massive pivot in the operation's scope. The physical sabotage teams in the jungle had done their job. Now, it was time for the psychological warfare specialists, the linguists, and the intelligence analysts to step out of the shadows. The United States military needed to launch a sophisticated, heavily layered disinformation campaign to artificially amplify the paranoia that the spiked ammunition was intended to create. But how do you convince an intensely disciplined, highly suspicious enemy military structure that the state-run factories in Beijing and Moscow are failing them? Furthermore, how do you broadcast this deception without revealing the invisible hand of the Central Intelligence Agency pulling the strings? The answer lay in the intricate art of forged intelligence, fake radio intercepts, and weaponizing the enemy's own communication networks against them. The psychological trap was set, but it needed a highly engineered trigger. To physically plant the invisible threat was a triumph of covert infiltration. But an explosive cartridge is utterly useless if the enemy simply attributes the resulting structural failure to bad luck. If a rifle shattered in the jungle and the surviving squad members wrote it off as a simple maintenance issue or a microscopic flaw in the steel, the psychological virus would be contained. The incident would remain a localized tactical elimination. To elevate this from a series of random battlefield accidents to a theater-wide bureaucratic crisis, military intelligence had to step in and aggressively connect the dots for the North Vietnamese High Command. The strategy required a sophisticated, heavily layered disinformation campaign. Intelligence officers at the Military Assistance Command Vietnam understood that they could not simply drop leaflets from the sky announcing that the Americans were spiking the ammunition. If they claimed responsibility, the enemy would instantly recognize it as a specialized sabotage operation, quarantine the suspected supply lines, and immediately request fresh, untainted logistical support. The absolute genius of this phase relied on misdirection. The American military needed to convince the communist forces that their own trusted allies were betraying them. Notice the strategic brilliance of this specific lie. The United States did not want the insurgents looking outward at the American reconnaissance teams. They wanted them looking inward, staring with deep suspicion at the state-run factories in Beijing and Moscow. To execute this deception, the Psychological Warfare Division began manufacturing an elaborate paper trail. Simply typing up a fake warning memorandum was not enough. The forgery had to be absolute perfection. Intelligence specialists procured the exact low-quality paper stock utilized by the Central Office for South Vietnam, the political and military headquarters for the insurgent forces. They matched the specific chemical composition of the mimeograph ink. They meticulously replicated the bureaucratic stamps and the highly formalized ideological language characteristic of communist political commissars. These forged directives were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. The documents warned field commanders that anti-revolutionary elements had infiltrated the Chinese munitions factories. The memorandums claimed that in a rush to meet massive production quotas, the factories in the People's Republic of China were turning out dangerously substandard ammunition, plagued by severe metallurgical flaws in the brass casings and highly unstable propellants. The directives explicitly warned insurgent officers to meticulously inspect their supply caches and to be wary of sudden, catastrophic weapon failures. Consider the maddening feedback loop this created for an enemy quartermaster. He receives a highly classified memorandum from his own high command warning him of defective rounds. He opens a crate of ammunition and inspects it. Because the American ordnance laboratories had done their jobs flawlessly, the counterfeited rounds looked absolutely perfect. There were no visible flaws. Yet, out in the field, rifles were inexplicably shattering. The quartermaster could not see the danger, but he knew it was there, hiding invisibly inside his own inventory. Disseminating these forged documents required its own dark operational art. You could not mail them. They had to be discovered organically. American forces began intentionally leaving these fake memorandums in the pockets of neutralized enemy couriers after conventional sweeps. They were deliberately left behind in hastily abandoned insurgent base camps, carefully placed among authentic logistical paperwork to ensure they would be found and routed up the enemy's chain of command. Simultaneously, American signals intelligence began operating clandestine black radio stations. Linguists fluent in specific regional dialects broadcasted directly on Viet Cong tactical frequencies. They posed as panicked insurgent units, frantically reporting to their higher headquarters that their weapons were tearing themselves apart during firefights, blaming the Chinese ammunition just as the forged documents had suggested. They flooded the enemy communication networks with artificial panic. The military planners in Saigon anxiously monitored the situation, waiting to see if the enemy would take the bait. The verification came through the very radio frequencies they were manipulating. The National Security Agency and military intelligence units began intercepting genuine, highly classified communications between North Vietnamese logistics commanders. The intercepts revealed a profound, systemic paranoia taking root deep within the communist military structure. The disinformation campaign had worked perfectly. Enemy field commanders were genuinely terrified. Intercepted reports showed insurgent officers demanding answers from their superiors about why they were being supplied with lethal, defective hardware. Some unit commanders flatly refused to distribute newly arrived crates of ammunition to their infantrymen, fearing a mass loss of operational capability. The logistical network, which had withstood thousands of tons of high explosives dropped by formations of B-52 Stratofortress bombers, was suddenly grinding to a halt because of internal paperwork and profound psychological doubt. For the infantrymen on the ground, the psychological toll was devastating. A soldier's weapon is their absolute foundation of survival. When that foundation fractures, unit cohesion evaporates. Pulling the charging handle of an AK-47 was no longer a routine action. It was an act laced with profound hesitation. The American intelligence community had successfully engineered a scenario where the enemy feared their own equipment more than they feared the American infantry. However, as the reports of shattered rifles and paralyzed enemy supply lines validated the program's immense success, a terrifying operational hazard began to materialize inside the American command structure. The very effectiveness of the psychological virus had created a massive blind spot. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a chaotic, porous environment. Ammunition did not strictly stay in enemy hands. American conventional forces, Allied South Vietnamese units, and long-range reconnaissance patrols frequently overran enemy positions and captured massive stockpiles of weapons. In the complex tactical reality of the jungle, captured enemy hardware was frequently utilized by free world forces. Elite reconnaissance teams often preferred to carry captured AK-47 rifles during deep penetration patrols. The distinct acoustic signature of the weapon, the heavy, unmistakable sound of the rifle firing, was a tactical advantage. If an American team initiated contact using enemy weapons, the opposing forces would momentarily hesitate, confused as to whether they were receiving friendly fire. Furthermore, during the early years of the conflict, the standard issue M16A1 rifle experienced well-documented reliability issues, leading some American and Allied troops to unofficially scavenge enemy rifles and ammunition to supplement their own combat loads. Suddenly, the intelligence officers who had masterminded this brilliant deception realized they had essentially booby-trapped the battlefield for their own personnel. Thousands of rigged cartridges and explosive mortar shells were circulating through the jungle, totally indistinguishable from safe ammunition. This realization presented the command staff with an agonizing institutional dilemma. How do you issue a massive theater-wide safety warning to hundreds of thousands of conventional troops without immediately exposing a highly classified black project? If the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, published a general order strictly forbidding the use of captured ammunition because it might be spiked with high explosives, the order would inevitably leak to the press. The moment an American journalist published an article about the covert sabotage program, the North Vietnamese High Command would read it. The entire illusion that the Chinese were supplying defective hardware would shatter instantly. The enemy would realize the failing weapons were an American trick. The logistical paranoia would evaporate, and the most successful psychological operation of the war would be permanently neutralized. Military planners were trapped in a paradox of their own making. They had to somehow recall an invisible weapon system that had already vanished into the fog of war. To thread this impossible needle, command staffs began issuing carefully worded, highly restrictive directives. Memorandums were circulated strictly prohibiting troops from firing captured enemy weapons, but the justification was heavily sanitized. The official reasoning provided to the conventional troops was that using enemy hardware disrupted standard logistical supply chains and increased the risk of friendly fire incidents due to the confusing acoustic signatures. But soldiers in a combat zone possess an acute sense of survival, and they are inherently suspicious of bureaucratic directives that do not align with their tactical reality. Whispers began to circulate through the fire bases and the rear echelon barracks. Reconnaissance operatives returning from classified insertions shared cryptic warnings with Allied units. The absolute secrecy required to maintain the psychological deception was slowly buckling under the sheer, uncontainable scale of the American military apparatus. The invisible weapon could not remain hidden forever. As the classified engineering schematics and operational parameters of the sabotage program sat securely in the vaults of the intelligence community, the slow, inevitable leak of information began to trickle toward the civilian press. The United States military was about to face the terrifying prospect of their most diabolical sabotage mission being dragged into the public light, raising the critical question of how history would ultimately judge an operation that intentionally blurred the lines between psychological manipulation and conventional warfare. The tipping point arrived in late 1969. Maintaining absolute compartmentalization across a sprawling multinational combat theater is an institutional impossibility. The United States military apparatus was simply too large, and the jungle environment too chaotic to keep an operation of this magnitude completely submerged forever. The leak did not come from a captured spy or a compromised operational laboratory. It emerged from the vast, porous nature of the conventional military itself. Whispers among long-range reconnaissance units, cryptic warnings traded between Allied infantrymen about scavenging enemy gear, and the sheer number of personnel required to process captured logistics eventually reached the ears of civilian correspondents. When a major American news publication printed a brief but highly accurate article outlining the existence of a covert initiative designed to booby-trap communist supply lines, the carefully constructed illusion fractured. Military intelligence officers at the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, watched in intense frustration as the perfectly engineered narrative of defective Chinese manufacturing evaporated. The enemy high command now had open-source confirmation that their shattering rifles and exploding mortar tubes were not the result of Allied betrayal, but rather a highly sophisticated American trap. The command staff had to react immediately. You cannot issue a public denial for a black project without inadvertently validating its existence to foreign intelligence services. Instead, the military executed a textbook administrative obfuscation. They abruptly and officially terminated Project Eldest Son on paper. However, the physical operation merely retreated deeper into the shadows. Planners hastily rebranded the entire initiative, first designating it Operation Italian Green, and later, as political scrutiny intensified and internal audits expanded, it was renamed Operation Polebean. This required massive logistical shifts. It meant rotating personnel out of the covert ordnance facilities, altering the highly classified infiltration coordinates, and entirely restructuring the communication protocols used by the specialized reconnaissance teams. The intelligence community was frantically attempting to outrun the exposure of its own success. Following the final quiet dissolution of the program in mid-1970, analysts retreated to secure facilities to assess the actual strategic footprint of the operation. With the declassified Pentagon records now available to historians, we can objectively evaluate the precise numerical scale of this unprecedented engineering effort. Over the lifespan of the project, technicians successfully counterfeited and inserted approximately 11,500 spiked 7.62 by 39 millimeter rifle cartridges. They also spliced roughly 3,000 sabotaged 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun rounds, nearly 1,000 rigged 82 millimeter mortar shells directly into the enemy logistical matrix. Look closely at those figures. 11,000 rifle cartridges might sound like an immense covert achievement for a small, multi-service special operations unit. Yet, when evaluated against the sheer mathematical volume of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, an entirely different reality emerges. The state-run arsenals of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were pumping hundreds of millions of rounds into Southeast Asia annually. Convoys of trucks and tens of thousands of porters moved mountains of hardware under the dense jungle canopy every single night. Mathematically, the inserted counterfeits represented a fraction of a percent of the total available enemy hardware. It was an invisible drop of contamination in an endless ocean of conventional munitions. This presents a profound operational paradox. How could such a statistically insignificant number of sabotaged rounds cripple a logistical network that routinely survived thousands of tons of high explosives dropped by formations of B-52 Stratofortress bombers? The answer lies in the fundamental mechanics of human psychology. You do not need to contaminate the entire ocean to make an infantryman refuse to drink from it. The temporary paralysis of communist supply chains, the intercepted radio communications revealing field commanders quarantining entire stockpiles, and the profound operational hesitation injected into the enemy ranks prove the core hypothesis of the intelligence planners. A meticulously targeted psychological virus could achieve strategic friction that conventional interdiction simply could not replicate. The enemy possessed the supplies, but they briefly lacked the confidence to utilize them. Despite this asymmetric success, the political and tactical climate was rapidly shifting. The broader conflict was drawing down, and to the extreme operational risk of inserting sterilized reconnaissance teams across sovereign borders into Laos and Cambodia began to outweigh the strategic benefits of the contamination program. The flights of unmarked UH-1 Iroquois helicopters skimming just above the dark foliage slowly ceased. The covert ordnance laboratory packed up its custom tooling, its perfectly balanced specific gravity explosive powders, and its meticulous forging equipment. But the conclusion of a military operation does not dictate the end of its physical consequences. When a conventional bombing campaign ceases, the craters eventually fill with monsoon rain, and the jungle slowly reclaims the shattered landscape. When an invisible, artisanal sabotage campaign ends, the landscape remains permanently, invisibly altered. The United States military had effectively shut down the initiative, but they possessed absolutely no mechanism to retrieve the dormant traps they had so carefully distributed. Following the withdrawal of Allied forces from South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese military absorbed vast stockpiles of captured hardware, consolidating supplies from deep jungle caches, overrun American fire bases, and abandoned logistical depots. Somewhere within those millions of crates hidden inside perfectly sealed zinc tins and wrapped in pristine wax paper, the customized explosive cartridges remained waiting. Consider the endurance of this specific military hardware. Standard small arms ammunition possesses an incredibly long shelf life if stored in proper, weather-resistant packaging. The specific high explosive compounds synthesized by the Central Intelligence Agency were chemically stable. They were engineered to endure extreme temperature fluctuations and severe humidity without degrading. The heavy wooden crates left in subterranean bunkers might eventually rot away, but the inner zinc tins, meticulously artificially aged and soldered, shut by technicians in Okinawa, were designed to protect their contents indefinitely. Furthermore, distinguish this threat from standard unexploded ordnance. Conventional explosive remnants, such as a dropped aerial bomb or a fired artillery shell that failed to detonate, are relatively easy to identify. They look like a hazard. They are rusted pieces of industrial metal lying in the dirt, visibly dangerous to anyone who encounters them. The sabotaged munitions of this operation are entirely different. They are inherently camouflaged. Because the counterfeit rounds were designed to pass intense visual inspections by paranoid quartermasters, they offer absolutely no visual warning to a modern observer. There is no external indicator that the propellant inside the brass casing has been swapped for a lethal, high-explosive payload designed to obliterate a steel receiver. Decades after the final transport planes departed, the physical legacy of this program continues to haunt the region. Historians and military ordnance disposal experts still actively debate the exact number of these counterfeited rounds currently circulating in the secondary arms market or sitting entirely undisturbed in the remote agricultural regions of Laos and Cambodia. Visualize a local farmer in the Annamite Range or a modern-day scrap metal collector unearthing a forgotten, collapsed subterranean bunker today. They discover what appears to be a perfectly preserved cache of vintage 7.62mm ammunition. The Cyrillic stencils on the metal are slightly faded, but the hardware looks completely authentic, possessing the exact weight and visual signature of reliable factory material. The trap engineered over half a century ago is still perfectly viable, resting quietly in the dark. The extreme difficulty of managing the blowback from the operation forced future military planners to severely rethink the long-term viability of untraceable supply chain sabotage. The institutional realization that an invisible weapon threatens friendly forces and civilian populations just as severely as enemy combatants became a foundational lesson in modern asymmetric warfare doctrine. You cannot introduce a completely invisible variable into a shared operational theater and expect to maintain absolute control over its trajectory. Project Eldest Son stands out in the historical record as a masterclass in unconventional warfare, representing the absolute apex of covert military engineering and psychological manipulation. It successfully weaponized the very concept of logistical trust, turning an enemy's absolute reliance on their own supply chains into a source of profound institutional paralysis. Yet, it also leaves behind a lingering strategic uncertainty. By intentionally blurring the lines between psychological warfare and physical sabotage, and by engineering a hidden threat designed to perfectly mimic standard military inventory, the architects of the program unleashed a tactical asset that was entirely blind to the cessation of hostilities. They built a weapon system so flawless in its deception that it successfully vanished into the fog of war, ensuring that the final shot of America's most deceptive operation may still be waiting to be fired.